Welcome to EconTalk, coming to you from the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any comments or feedback for us here at EconTalk, please send me an email at roberts, R-O-B-E-R-T-S, roberts@gmu.edu. You can find more EconTalk at www.econtalk.org, along with readings and links related to this podcast. My guest today is Alex Tabarrok, my colleague here at George Mason University, who blogs brilliantly at marginalrevolution.com. We're going to talk about the economics of medicine. Alex, good to have you on EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ. Good to be here.
Well, you've done a lot of reading and writing and thinking about the economics of medicine, and particularly the challenges of being a doctor in today's world, which involves malpractice and the risk of a lawsuit that alleges malpractice. Could you tell me a little bit, and our listeners, about the environment today for a doctor worried about malpractice and lawsuits?
Well, I think I can. The American Medical Association, I think, is now saying that medical liability reform is their top priority because higher insurance premiums have been going up dramatically, have in fact been causing some doctors to retire early, to reduce the scope of their practice, to practice more defensive medicine, even to move to another state. So the AMA says that rapidly increasing medical liability insurance premiums caused by escalating jury awards are seriously threatening patient access to care.
And do you think that's true?
Well, of course, their ox is the one being gored, and once your ox being gored, you're likely to make it more gory than it actually is. But it is true that medical malpractice premiums have increased dramatically since about 1999. Going up by 50%, 60%, 70% in some specialties and in some states. So I can certainly understand why the doctors are upset.
And what are some of the, when you say they've gone up, what are some of the levels? What's roughly what might a doctor pay in insurance, in an insurance premium to protect him or herself against a lawsuit?
It varies dramatically by what state you're in, and also by your specialty. So if we take a doctor in, for example, internal medicine, where you are essentially diagnosing patients, it's not that bad. It might be $10,000 per year. On the other hand, if you take a specialty like OBGYN, where you are delivering babies and you're dealing mostly with a healthy group of patients, it can be $50,000 a year. In some states, it might be as high as $100,000 or $150,000 a year. And so if you're an OBGYN and you're in a state where the where premiums have been increasing, your premium might have doubled from $50,000 to $100,000 a year in the past 5 years.
There are really two issues here, and I'd like you to talk about them separately and explain why they're different. Obviously, if I'm a doctor, I don't want to get sued. It's embarrassing. And it's painful, and it's costly in terms of time, and it could be very costly in terms of money. But once I have insurance, one might think the idea of insurance is to reduce your risk. So why would doctors be upset about the fact that the cost of reducing that risk has gone up? It's now more expensive to insure yourself against a bad lawsuit or a good lawsuit, any kind of lawsuit. Wouldn't they just incorporate those costs into their business like any other business does with insurance? Won't they just charge more?
Some of that can be done, but on the other hand, medical care, so much of it is involved with the government, with Medicaid and Medicare and so forth, where prices are fixed, or with dealing with HMOs, that this does put a squeeze on the doctors. Moreover, I think that's right in the long run. I think that is true. Patients, in the long run, will be the ones to bear these costs. But when you see premiums going up by 50% or 100%, over the space of a few years, then that's not something which can be worked out, which can be easily passed on right away to patients and to others.
So doctors are finding themselves earning less money. Are they having less fun? You hear the claim that being a doctor is less fun than it used to be because of the paperwork, et cetera. Does this insurance issue come into play there, or is that just related to other bureaucratic concerns of insurance, government payments, and other things?
When I talk to doctors, I think there's a lot of truth to that. They just don't like operating in this environment where they can easily be sued at any time in any place, because it's a lot of time constraint, as you say. It's embarrassing, and it's just an unpleasant atmosphere to work in when you're trying to deal with a patient and you're thinking, not, what do I need to do to make this patient healthier? You're thinking, what tests do I need to order so that I can't possibly be accused of not having done my work carefully? What do I have to do to cover my butt so that I'm not going to be sued? Doctors don't want to think that. They don't want to spend time thinking about those sorts of things. They want to be dealing with patients. That's, after all, why they went into the business, to help out patients. Not to deal with lawyers all the time.
I thought the Hippocratic Oath had something about malpractice premiums. I guess I must have an old or a new version, I guess. I'm confused.
Yeah.
But there are two issues here again, and I want to maybe we'll take them one at a time. So one issue you've laid out is that the malpractice environment's very unpleasant, the threat of a lawsuit. But then on top of that, insuring yourself against that threat, against that risk, has gotten increasingly expensive, and it's a cost that's very difficult for doctors to recoup in the short run when those costs are rising dramatically. So why are those costs of insurance rising dramatically? What are some of the explanations for that?
Well, most of the cost of insurance, most of the cost of an insurance company is simply paying out payouts, paying awards, settlements and awards when they're being sued. So my common sense kind of view is that the major reason why premiums have gone up is that tort awards have gone up.
Say that again. Tort awards. What do you mean by tort awards?
I mean, when a doctor is sued, and either in a settlement or at trial, a jury just says, you've got to pay $1 million or $2 million or $10 million. Those awards have gone up. So doctors are having to pay more when they are successfully sued. And those trial awards also influence settlements. So if doctors know that awards have gone up, then they're going to have to settle for more. So that's what the insurance company, after all, is insuring against. It's insuring against having to pay these payouts, these awards.
But what about insurance company profits? Have they been going up or down?
They have definitely not been going up. And in fact, some companies have been leaving the business. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about price gouging in a minute, but
well, let's talk about it now. Isn't there a theory that the reason that premiums are going up is because insurance companies are greedy and have just raised their rates on doctors to take advantage of them?
Absolutely. So
absolutely true.
Absolutely. Some people say that.
Oh, all right.
True.
You made me nervous there, Alex.
Okay. For example, J. Robert Hunter, who is director of insurance for the Consumer Federation of America, he says insurance companies are price gouging their doctors. Or Connecticut Attorney General Richard Blumenthal, he says that expensive insurance rates become a matter of life and death when they drive doctors out of business, as is happening in Connecticut. Insurance company greed can be hazardous to our health. Russ, you might remember that Connecticut Attorney General Richard Blumenthal, he was actually in the papers just a few days ago saying that the gas companies have been price gouging. So clearly he has price gouging on the mind.
I'm always a little suspicious of those gouging theories. They're one of the challenges of defending a gouging hypothesis is the timing of the gouging. Like, why weren't they gouging before?
That's
right?
Absolutely. I had an email correspondent write to me. Well, if gouging is not the answer, he wrote to me, the insurance companies have the luxury of raising their prices when business is bad. And my response is, why don't they raise their price when business is good?
Yeah, I mean, the last time I looked, they're not charities. They seem to like making money. So one of the challenges of that gouging hypothesis is trying to explain why they just feel avaricious and grasping when consumers are least able to take account of it.
That's exactly right.
Kind of bizarre.
This goes back to the point you raised earlier. What about the profits of these insurance companies? Well, you'd predict that if there's all this gouging going on, that must be good for the insurance companies. Yep. In fact, lots of them have been leaving the business. the St. Paul company.
Well, that just proves how altruistic they are. They're
Yeah.
leaving. They want to let some of their brethren exploit consumer doctors with insurance premiums. They've had enough. It's time to let some other insurance company come in and make a killing.
It's a guilty conscience.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
couldn't take those profits on anymore.
Oh, the shame of it.
The shame of it. Exactly. Exactly.
So that hypothesis is not borne out by the profit data.
Well,
What's the
it's not
alternative?
borne out by the profit data. It's not borne out by logic. It's also not borne out by empirical, testing. So my co-author and I, in a recent Manhattan Institute study, Amanda Agan is my co-author, we said, well, look, if price gouging is the explanation, the only way that gouging can work is where there's a lack of competition. So let's look at the data. Is in states where the big firms have a larger share of the market, do we see higher prices in those states for medical malpractice insurance premiums?
The presumption being that if you have a large market share, there's less competition, and you should, according to this gouging theory, be able to exploit the doctors.
Exactly right. And what do we find? We find that no. In fact, we find the exact opposite. That in states where a large share of the market is taken up by just a few firms, we actually find lower prices. Now, you might think, well, doesn't that violate economic theory? With monopoly, don't you expect higher prices? No, actually, it doesn't violate economic theory.
Oh, phew, I'm so relieved. For a minute there, I thought I was going to have to go out and find another job.
Right.
Don't scare me like that. Come on.
Well, what you have to ask is, how do firms get big in the first place?
Good point.
You can't just look at where the firm is today. You have to ask, how is it that this firm got big? And a firm gets big by having efficiencies, by having lower costs. And because their costs are lower, the price lower, and they drive the inefficient firms out of the business. So actually, it's not that surprising that just like Walmart grows big by lowering prices, that insurance firms, which have lower costs, can drive prices down and actually expand their share of the market.
Very reasonable. Okay, so the gouging theory, let's put that to the side. That does not explain the recent sudden increases and dramatic increases in premiums that insurance companies are charging doctors for malpractice. So what are we left with? What's your explanation?
Well, my explanation is that awards have gone up.
Jury awards or settlements by doctors in lawsuits.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And, there's no doubt that this is true. Now, we do have to add one a complication to the model. And that is that it's very difficult for an insurance firm to predict future awards. And insurance firms need to do that because the premiums that they charge today have to cover future payouts. So insurance firms need to be able to predict, are awards going to go up in the future? Are they going to level off? Are they going to decline? Is tort reform going to work? You have to predict all of these things. And it's a very difficult job to do. So it's not surprising that sometimes firms get it wrong. And in fact, during approximately 1986 to about 1999, insurance firms actually were wrong, but they were wrong in that their premiums were too low relative to awards. Nobody complained back then, of course.
Strangely enough.
That premiums were too low. So now insurance firms have realized, unfortunately, that medical malpractice awards are permanently higher, or at least for the foreseeable future, they have risen to a much higher level. And so some of the increase in recent years has been a belated recognition of the fact that awards are much higher.
And as a result, they've raised their rates to try to cover the cost of what they expect to be higher awards coming down the pike.
That's right. In the long run, the premiums are going to track payouts.
Because of competition.
Because of competition, that's right. If their premiums are below payouts, you have bankruptcies and firms leave the industry. If premiums are above payouts, you have competition, you have free entry, you have other firms entering into the industry. So in the long run, premiums are going to track payouts. In fact, for every dollar increase in payouts, there's a 1-to-1 increase in premiums. Every dollar increase in payouts leads to $2 in premium.
Eventually.
In the short run, we can have deviations from that because it's difficult to forecast these things. But in the long run, it's $1 to $1.
So your claim is that these rising rates are due to the fact that juries have gotten more generous in these malpractice suits. And what other type of evidence is there that this is true? You have some evidence, I think, on state by state differences?
Right, that is correct. So this is not simply true across the nation as a whole. Some states, the juries in those states, the judges too, I don't want to blame it all on juries. The juries and the judges in those states are much more generous. I'll go with that, but let's put that in quotes.
Yeah.
They give much higher damages than in other states.
Now this is the key point, though. I want to ask. Obviously, when we say that malpractice awards are going up, they could be going up because juries feel a certain way relative to how they felt in the past. It could be because certain procedures are more risky on average than the past procedures, or it could be because the actual damages have gone up. But what you're saying is that for the same level of malpractice, that is the same error, like leaving the scalpel in the patient after you sewed him up, or taking out the wrong, amputating the wrong leg.
Yes.
You're saying if I hold that constant, how much I have to pay in a malpractice suit if I lose is not the same across states, and it varies dramatically. Is that true?
That's exactly right. So, for example, medical malpractice premiums are about 6 times higher in Pennsylvania than they are in Wisconsin. Now, you can explain some of that perhaps in Pennsylvania, the population is older or something along those lines. You can explain some of that, but
more urban density, whatever
right.
that means. I'm not sure which way that goes.
Who knows which way it goes? We actually test for some of those effects in our paper. But could it really be possible that medical malpractice is 6 times more egregious in Pennsylvania than in Wisconsin? Or are the doctors in Pennsylvania 6 times worse than those in Wisconsin? Or to put it another way, if you had one of these wonderful doctors from Wisconsin, if he moved to Pennsylvania, would he be paying the old Wisconsin rates because he was a great Wisconsin doctor, or would he be paying the new Pennsylvania rates?
So there must be something in the water, and it's probably Lake Erie combined with maybe failure to win the Super Bowl in the eastern part of the state. Now it's complicated, obviously, but I'm being silly. But let me ask a serious question. Obviously, the examples you gave, the explanations you gave, are not right. It's not true that Pennsylvania doctors are poorly trained relative to Wisconsin doctors, or that Pennsylvania patients, on average, have 6 times more dangerous procedures. So what is the explanation?
That's right. So one of the explanations, or sadly to say, one of the reasons why awards differ so dramatically across the state has nothing to do with medical malpractice whatsoever, but has to do with political factors. For example, in states which elect their judges, particularly ones using partisan elections, where the judges run under a party banner as a Republican or a Democrat, in those states, awards are much higher, just because the judges are elected. And you can kind of see some of the logic for that.
How much higher?
They're
roughly
$35,000 higher on average.
And what's the logic there?
Well, the logic is that...
Well, or the illogic. It's really depressing.
That's right.
Although I have to say, the idea of, I hate it when people talk about Republican economists or Democrat economists. But as bad as that is, I think it's even worse to talk about a Republican judge or a Democrat judge. In theory, you'd think a judge would care about the law. What difference would it make under which party banner they run? But I guess it does matter.
Well, it's not so much which party they run under, but the fact that they have to run in competitive elections.
So what's the implication?
The implication is that the plaintiff is almost always going to be a local person, a potential voter. While the defendant might be a corporation, an insurance corporation headquartered in another state perhaps. So the plaintiff, if the judge is elected, the plaintiff is often a constituent. The potential he and his family and his friends are potential voters. So elected judges are going to be somewhat biased towards plaintiffs. Moreover, if one looks at where do judges in states which use partisan elections, where do they get their money for their campaign
Yeah, that would
funds?
be the key question.
Exactly. Where do they get that money from? Giving the money. And, typically it's the lawyers. 80 to 90% of campaign funds for judges come from lawyers. And, of course, the lawyers are interested in judges who give higher awards. That's how they make their money.
They've always loved the law. They just give out of the thrill of participating, I guess. Let me ask it, but a different part of that is the following. You'd think, let's recreate the logic. You're saying that they respond to their constituents. Now, usually we think that's a good thing, right?
Right.
Usually we say we want elected officials to respond to their constituents. In this case, presumably you feel that that's not so good. And I guess my related question would be, well, okay, so the lawyers bias the judges toward big awards by giving them money and trying to influence them. Why don't the doctors give? And why don't the doctors counterbalance that? And why wouldn't other constituents who are now living in this state with these high medical malpractice premiums, why wouldn't they resent these judges who impose these costs on their neighbors, their doctors, who eventually are going to end up charging them higher prices? And there's a lot of questions there. See what you can do.
I think they're very good questions. One reason is let's think about this a little bit more generally, because this applies to not just medical malpractice cases, but to tort cases, personal injury cases, product liability, as well as medical malpractice. And if we think about a pharmaceutical firm, let us imagine, right? It can be sued at any time, in any place, in any one of 3,000 counties in the United States. So the pharmaceutical...
And every drug has side effects. By definition, every drug has some individual who's going to have a bad reaction that can be put in front of a jury as a possible malfeasance liability issue.
That's exactly right. Every drug that works has side effects.
Right, even the best drugs.
That's
Penicillin kills people.
Oh, aspirin kills several thousand people a year. That's exactly right. So, because of this, it can be sued at any time, any place in the country. It doesn't know which judge is going to be ruling in its case. And by the time the judge has been assigned, it's too late for the pharmaceutical company to get in there with its own money. That is really going to look odd.
It's a little gauche, I guess, to deliver the frozen lasagna. It reminds me of this Representative Jefferson who was caught with roughly $100,000 in cash in his freezer and food packages. That was a bribe in the news recently. But I guess it'd be a little gauche for Pfizer to put cash in a judge's freezer while he was out.
That's right. On the other hand, the lawyers, particularly the plaintiffs' lawyers, they see the same judges over and over again. They're repeat players in the business. So that's why they're the ones who are the primary givers to campaigns. Because they know, well, if I don't see this guy this week, I'm going to see him next week. And, he's going to remember who was generous to him at the time that he needed to be reelected and he needed help. He's going to remember.
It's a very cynical interpretation, Alex, but I suspect...
Thank you, Russ.
But I suspect it's part of human nature. Even if he doesn't intentionally say, this guy helped me, he may be influenced one way or the other.
And actually, I don't even need intention, because it could be the case. Suppose there are just two judges, and one of them honestly believes in higher awards, the other one honestly does not. Which one is the lawyer going to support for re-election?
That's an easy choice.
Exactly.
So that explains some of the difference then. This somewhat unintuitive, perhaps, idea that having judges be elected forces them to raise money from folks who have a vested interest in their decision. Not a very attractive aspect of life, but it is a real aspect of life. But you said, for example, it might amount to a $35,000 difference. That is not enough to sustain the six-fold difference between Pennsylvania and Wisconsin.
Now, let me give you a few other things which matter as well. Another thing which matters is there's a famous statement by Tom Wolfe, who said that the Bronx jury redistributes the wealth. And what he meant is that juries in counties with a lot of poverty tend to be much more generous in their awards. Indeed, if you look at awards, and this is tort awards generally, not just medical malpractice, but if you look at awards in counties with low poverty rates, average award might be $500,000. With about a 4% poverty rate, let's say. You go up to a poverty rate of 25%, and the average award is closer to $2 million. So simply by bringing a case in a county which has a lot of poverty, the award can increase for exactly the same case, can increase by 4 or 5 times.
But Wisconsin has poor places. Don't the Wisconsin lawyers try to find those poor juries also?
I bet they do, but if you really want a poor county, going back to Pennsylvania, it's the Philadelphia jury. For example, in the past few years, between 1999 and 2001, the Philadelphia juries alone returned approximately 81 verdicts with an award greater than $1 million. That was almost the same as in all of California. I think there were 101 verdicts of that size. So Philadelphia alone had almost as many $1 million verdicts as all of California.
Is that driven perhaps by a handful of very skilled lawyers in one particular jurisdiction, in a handful of jurisdictions? I'm sure Philadelphia is not the only place, but that are skilled at getting that jury chosen, skilled at getting in front of the right judge? Is it a small number of outliers here that are really causing these differentials?
I think it is. It's primarily driven by what we would call the right-hand tail, by these outliers, and
by outliers we mean a handful of extreme numbers, yeah.
Extremely high awards. And I think this goes back to the point about cynicism, which you mentioned earlier. It's not that I believe that every elected judge is biased, or that every high poverty jury gives excessively high awards. It's that when you bring several of these things together, bring elected judges in a high poverty county with a very good lawyer, that is a recipe for a multi-million-dollar, tens of millions, hundreds of millions perhaps. So it's that combination of things.
With the consequent high premiums for insurance, with the resulting high costs and unpleasantness of being a doctor, and then the resulting reduction in choice and practice by doctors. So let's take this as of course, one view says, that's good. Hey, it's good. We want those high awards. There's a natural impulse for some, those of us who are not lawyers. I think when we hear about Pennsylvania having awards that are 6 times larger than Wisconsin's, we might say, oh my gosh, something's wrong in Philadelphia, which of course many people have argued for a long time.
Or we might say something's wrong in Wisconsin.
Right, that's the alternative. Right. The alternative is that those poor people in Wisconsin, they just don't have the protection that people in Pennsylvania have. What's your take on that?
Well, I think we have to ask, we want a civil justice system, a tort system, to do 2 things. One is to compensate people who have been unjustly or negligently injured. And the other is to deter bad practices. Now let's look at compensation first. Is the civil justice system a good method of compensation? And the answer is, unfortunately, it's terrible. It's terrible because by the time the lawyers and the administrative costs have been taken out of a jury award, the person who is injured gets less than half. So it takes about 60%, 60 cents on every dollar to get that dollar from the defendant to the plaintiff. It's a very expensive system, much more expensive, for example, than simply having a Blue Cross insurance.
But now you're telling me that it's even worse for Wisconsin. Not only do they only get 1/6 of the amount that those good souls in Pennsylvania get, but they only get to keep 1/12 of it. So it's even more strong. You're making the case that the system's broken in the wrong direction.
So that turns us to the issue of deterrence. Do these high awards deter bad practices by doctors? And if they did, then I wouldn't be a critic of the system. But the evidence seems to be that these tort awards are so random. They hit the good doctors almost as much as they hit the bad doctors. And a lot of the time they don't hit the bad doctors at all. And when they do hit, as I say, it's random almost between the good and the bad doctors, that the system doesn't deter very much. So we're not getting, we're transferring a lot of money where a lot of it is going down the funnel. A lot of it is being wasted in the process, and we're not getting very much deterrence.
I guess the issue would be more than just this deterrence issue, because it's hard for, I think, for people to be comfortable with this idea, but economists actually believe that there's a possibility of too much deterrence, right? So if we had the awards being, one view says, well, the bigger the award, the better, because then they'll just be more defensive, more careful. Better to have more caution, better to take more care. But the economist's view is that there's such a thing as too much care, and that as a result of the current system, defensive medicine is very costly and discourages the use of good medicine because of the cost. That we have to go through all these extra tests, all these extra procedures, all these extra drugs that are merely being done, not merely, I shouldn't say that are where the return to those tests and treatments aren't worth it, but are only being done to discourage the risk of lawsuit. That's the worry, right?
Yeah, I do think that defensive medicine is a problem, though it's controversial in the literature because it's very difficult to say, what tests shouldn't be doing, which ones are the excessive ones,
right? Yeah, the ones that are done on my neighbor.
That's right.
But having said that, sorry for interrupting,
Sure.
because it's an important point. It's tempting to say that it's hard to define and that I always want the most caution, but I don't always want the most caution because some of these tests are risky for the patient.
Yes.
And the doctor wants those tests because that's considered best practice. But I, as the patient, might say, hey, no, I don't want that test. But the doctor often tries to just kind of slip it in because he or she wants to be insured against the risk of a suit.
That's right.
So it is a little more complicated.
I think we have too many cesareans in the United States, for example. And one reason...
Too many, say that again?
Too many C-sections.
Uh-huh.
Too many cesarean deliveries.
Because?
Because doctors do those to avoid the possibility of a injured baby.
Or an injured mom.
Or an injured mom. And I think they often do it too rapidly. Certainly the number of C-sections has been increasing in the United States. And just like court awards and premiums, the number of C-sections varies across the United States dramatically. So why is it, 30% in some counties and only 5% in other counties?
Are there more C-sections in Pennsylvania than in Wisconsin?
I don't know that
birth?
specific, but I do know that it does vary with awards. It does vary.
Well, we're almost out of time, Alex. It's been fascinating. I want to close and ask you, the obvious question: what is to be done? Given this, you've painted a fairly depressing picture for those of us in the consumer and patient and doctor world, which is we have an erratic set of jury awards that leads to an erratic set of insurance premiums, which leads to very different environments across states for the practice of medicine and being a patient that where those environments are not related to patient medical issues, but merely due to the legal environment. So what should be done about that?
Well, you've left the hardest question to last, of course.
Well, but I won't give you much time, so you can easily bow out with a few simple platitudes if you need to.
All right, let me say this, is that we could, and we have in some cases, put caps on awards. And those do seem to work. However, I think that's a very crude method of tort reform. So what I would like to see is us...
give me your ideal. Don't give me what's politically feasible.
Okay. I would like to see us move towards more specialized courts. Courts where the judges and perhaps specialized juries see many medical malpractice cases and develop some greater expertise into what is truly negligent behavior and what instead is the result of simple random chance. Because a lot of these problems come from the sad fact that some children, for example, are going to be born with birth defects. And separating out those ones who were born because of doctor negligence and those ones who were simply born because of nature's negligence, if you want to put it that way, is a very difficult job for lay people to do. And so I'd like to see judges who have more experience in medical malpractice cases and perhaps specialized juries as well.
What about political changes? What about, one of the obvious problems with jury awards and judge awards is the incentives, right? A jury and a judge, whether they're the most rational or unemotional group in the world, no matter how you slice it, they do not bear any responsibility for their decision.
Right.
Right? Is there any proposal out there that would, to me, that's the biggest problem. A jury that moved by the skill of a lawyer or a judge who is, for whatever reason, sympathetic to one side or another, could be either side, plaintiff or defendant, makes a decision where the consequences of making a bad decision are virtually zero. The out-of-pocket is certainly zero. The only consequence is your conscience. And a conscience is an important and wonderful thing, but most juries and most judges don't look ahead at the consequences of those decisions. And so is there any way to impose some consequences for bad decisions on the people who make those decisions, or change who makes those decisions and put it in the hands of people who have that responsibility?
I think we may be able to change who makes those decisions in the following way. Is if judges would respect contracts, then it's certainly possible to beforehand have patients and doctors and their HMOs and hospitals decide what kind of tort system do we want. How are we going to, if there's a dispute, how is it going to be resolved? And instead of taking it to the courts, to take it to arbitration, for example. So allowing and enforcing contracts which are made ahead of time can take these decisions out of the hands of judges and juries and put them back into the hands of patients and doctors. That requires, however, that ultimately the judges say, look, if this has been decided by contract in advance, we are going to respect those contracts and not override them.
And they don't respect those now?
Often they do not.
And I guess the idea here would be a similar example of if I wanted to waive my rights to sue my doctor because I was a high-risk patient or I was pursuing a high-risk procedure, I can't really waive my rights, which sounds like a good thing. Why would you want to be able to waive your rights? But the reason you'd want to is to encourage a doctor to take a chance on a high-risk situation. But ultimately, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that you really can't waive your rights. If something does go wrong, you can always sue and say, well, what judge or jury would say, well, he wanted to get the doctor to take a chance, but when it didn't turn out well, of course the doctor should be liable.
That's right. I mean, when the judges and juries see injured plaintiffs who are perhaps emotionally compelling, unfortunately, they tend to, not all of them by any means, but some of them will tend to say, well, let's put aside the law, let's put aside what these parties agreed to by contract, and let's do what is, quote, the right thing. Let's support this injured plaintiff, this poor person, so forth. Unfortunately, in the long run, that doesn't benefit anybody. It harms a lot of them.
Maybe we need a TV show, American Victim. And each week we'd put on a set of people who were, damaged by what was probably just bad luck, but maybe it was malpractice. And then we could send in money. We could create maybe a pool that we would award to the people. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, you might American Victim. It could be the next hot thing.
I doubt it.
You better patent that.
I doubt it. Alex, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for such an interesting and provocative set of ideas and findings, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Russ.
You've been listening to EconTalk, www.econtalk.org. Thanks for joining us.